Okay, so today's video is going to focus on ecology. It's the beginning of our ecology information. It's going to focus mostly on competition and resource availability and population growth. So let's do a very brief vocabulary review before we get started with it. So the first one we have is population. I need to be able to use these words and not worry about you guys knowing what they mean. So we've got two examples of populations in this first picture here. So there's a rabbit population. There's a bison population, and then actually there's also a grass population. But the population is just going to be the same species in one particular area. Okay, so the population, again, we're referring to the same species in one particular location. So a population would not be rabbits in Texas and rabbits in Europe. Okay, so they have to be in the same location as well. The second word is a community. And that's what we have happening over here. So community is going to be all of the biotic or living things that are interacting in one particular area. So in this case, I've got the grass, and this deer, and the butterfly, and the hawk, and the coyote, and the pronghorn, and the jackrabbit, all in those trees. Okay, all of those make up the community. The biotic factors, again, in one particular area. All three of these are going to be focused on one particular area. And so then the last one here would be an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is going to include all your abiotic factors. Remember, those are your non-living factors, as well as your biotic factors. So taking into account all those things that were in the community, the grasses, the pronghorn, the coyote, butterfly, hawk, and then you bring in things like your bring in your abiotic factors, water vapor, water in the ground, minerals in the ground, light availability, air, okay, rocks, the soil content. Okay, all of those things would factor into our abiotic factors. So we've got a population, community, and an ecosystem. Okay, the majority of our ecosystems are going to be built around the availability of resources. And resources, as most of you guys know, they are not unlimited. Okay, they have what's called a finite amount. So there is a limited number of resources. Resources can also be called a limiting factor in an ecosystem, because they are going to limit or control and have a major impact on the population size of that ecosystem, community, population, because there is a finite amount of them. The resources that we are usually going to be working with are things like water, food, space. That would include, shelter, habitat, energy. All of these have a limited amounts of them that are available. And because there is a finite, or limited amount of them that are available, they are going to cause competition to happen. Okay? Organisms are going to have to compete or fight against one another to get these limited resources. Okay? And one of the things that we need to realize is that this competition is not always a bad thing. This competition does ensure that the strongest, most well-suited for that particular environment, those are the organisms that are the ones that are surviving and reproducing. Okay, so let's look at what this maximum, this limited amount of resources that are available, what they can do to the maximum population size. So we need to talk about something that's called the carrying capacity. Okay, and so carrying capacity is, again, it's our maximum population size. Okay, so it's our maximum population size that is going to be due to these limited resources, due to these limiting factors. Okay, and we've got two kinds of limiting factors. Okay, we've got density dependent as well as density independent. Okay, so we've got density dependent factors and density independent factors. And so density dependent factors are going to be dependent upon the population density. These would be things like the spread of disease, the availability of food, the availability of water. Those things would be density dependent. The population density has an impact on these. density independent factors that can limit a population size, these are usually environmental factors, things that population density does not have an impact on. For instance, if there is a hurricane coming to the coast of Florida, that hurricane does not care if it's hitting Miami or hitting the dinky little town that I grew up in. Okay? It is a density independent factor. Population density does not impact whether this factor is going to come into the ecosystem, the impact this factor will have on the ecosystem. So because of competition, not every single member of the population is going to survive. And so we see this carrying capacity. So populations will have this maximum level they can reach before basically they run out of resources. There's not enough food, there's not enough water, there's not enough shelter, and it may be a combination of all of those things that limit their population. It may just be the availability of water. Okay, it doesn't matter. But there is some limit to the population size due to the resources that are available. And again, that's our carrying capacity. So in the beginning, when our population is low, when I've got very few individuals and my population is low, it's growing very rapidly. I have a very rapid growth in my population. And that portion is called my exponential growth. Okay? During exponential growth, there is a rapid growth in the population because there's plenty of resources available. Population size is very small, so there's not an issue with not enough food or not enough water or not enough space. Over time, though, as the population continues to grow, you'll notice it slows down in its growth. It's not growing quite as rapidly, okay? And eventually it will actually decrease growth. And when it decreases in growth, that's a signal that we've reached our carrying capacity, that no more that particular area cannot support a bigger population because there's just not enough resources available to it. So eventually we'll see a graph that will end up looking like this. Okay, it will have exponential growth in the beginning. So that's that very rapid growth because there's plenty of resources available. And then it will eventually level out. This whole thing together, where I'm getting this curve that's shaped like an S, okay, this is called our logistical model of growth, or logistic growth model. It has an S-shaped curve. Okay, it's got the exponential growth in the beginning, and then eventually it will even out right around the carrying capacity there. And you'll notice it's going back and forth between slightly above and slightly below the carrying capacity because the population cannot instantaneously fix itself. The population does not know that it has reached its carrying capacity of 500 individuals and no more can be born. Okay, so there is a constant vacillation between a little bit too high, a little bit too low, but it hovers right around that carrying capacity. Competition's at its peak here, so you're ensuring that the organisms that are the best suited to the environment, that they are the ones that are actually surviving here. So we can actually calculate the growth rate of a population. And you guys will do a little bit of this in class. So we can calculate the growth rate of the population. Okay, and so our growth rate of our population is going to be our change in N. Remember, the delta or the triangle is change. Okay, so our change in N, this is going to be our change in the population. Is the population getting bigger? Is it getting smaller? So it's our growth rate, right? Is it a positive change, and so it's getting bigger, and negative change, it's getting smaller. And the equation to do this is our change in N is going to equal R times N times K minus N divided by K. Well, that looks super fun. Well, let's kind of talk about what those things are, and you'll realize that this really isn't that big of a deal. Okay, so our R, this is our rate of growth. Well, if you pause for a second and you think about the things that could impact the rate of growth, our rate of growth is going to be our birth rate. That would obviously have an impact on the population, plus our immigration. Both of these things are going to increase our population, right? Well, then we also need to take into account, if we're talking about our rate of growth, the things that could decrease the population. So our death rate could decrease the population. It's not an equal sign. That's a minus sign. As well as our immigration, things leaving the population. Okay, so that would be our rate of growth. Usually you really only are factoring in birth rate and death rate. Okay, but if your problem or your scenario talks about immigration and immigration, you need to remember to factor them in. Okay, so your rate of growth again is just your change in the growth of the population. So you're taking into account birth rate, death rate, immigration, and immigration. Okay, so we've already talked about our change in N. Okay, so that's our change in our population. And that's what we're usually trying to figure out. Okay, our rate of growth is our R. So what's our plain old N? Well, if delta N is the change in the population, then N is my population, my current population size. Okay, and then K is actually what we use to represent carrying capacity. Okay, so K stands for the carrying capacity. And you may find that from a graph. They may give it to you. You may be given a set of data and you determine the carrying capacity. That's one of the things you'll see in the activity that we will do in class is you'll gather all your data and draw your graph, and you will see that there is that you can determine carrying capacity from that. So K stands for our carrying capacity or our resources that are available to us. So the equation looks rough, but it's relatively easy to figure out what everything is in the equation. Let's run through a couple types of competition real quick, and then we'll be all done. So the first one we have here is what's called intraspecific competition. Okay, if you remember, intra is within. So this is competition within a species. You see these are two males of the same species that are competing for something. They could be competing for a mate, they could be competing for food, for shelter, okay? But this is competition within the same species. This is part of what causes that carrying capacity to occur in particular species, is they are going to eventually, they want the same food, they want to live in the same place, so they will compete amongst one another. Okay? Your difference here, really, your big difference between interspecific and interspecific competition is that this will include competition for a mate. Okay? So in addition to your typical food, water, shelter, you're also competing for a mate with interspecific competition. So interspecific competition, this would be competition between different species. Remember, intra is within, inter is between. So you can see on this diagram here, there's competition between the lady beetles and the lacewings for a food source for the aphids. So they're competing between a different species. And usually you see this kind of competition if there is an overlapping niche. I know some people say niche, some people say niche. Okay, so if there are, but you know what I'm talking about. So if there's an overlapping niche or niche here, then they're going to end up competing for the same source, for the same resources. Okay, so the niche is, it's how the population, essentially it's how the population fits into the environment or the ecosystem. Okay, it's the population's use of the resources that are available to it. Okay, and its role in the environment. So it's and its response to the environment. So it's the use of the resources, how it interacts with the environment. That's its niche. Okay? And so eventually you can actually have niche competition that will get so intense that it can wipe one of the species out. So if you look on these graphs, you can see these are two different types of paramecium. Remember, those were kinds of protist. Okay? And when they are grown together here, you can see that the paramecium caudatum, it loses. Okay? It could eventually die out. Okay? Which again is going to be due to that niche competition. Their competition is so severe, is so intense here, that they're competing for the same things. A way around this is if the organisms will find and fill different niches, even though they're in the same particular area. An example of this would be what are called the anole lizards. Okay, and in their habitat, here you're going to see my lovely drawing. Okay, so there's tree. It's a forest type habitat, but it also has some shrubs, okay, and there's some grass. And so you will see lizards, that one population of lizards lives up high in the trees. One population lives more along the actual tree trunk itself. Another population will live down on the floor. Okay? And so even though you have 3 different populations of the same kind of, basically same kind of lizard, okay, that are going to want the same kind of food and need the same kind of resources, because they're essentially living at different levels of the habitat, okay, they're all now able to survive. So let's look at what we have here. Non-native, or they're sometimes called invasive species. We talked briefly about this when we did the Good Buddies PowerPoint. We saw the kudzu vine. Okay, so a non-native or an invasive species, these are going to be brought in by humans. Okay, like I said, these are things like you see the Burmese python has become a invasive species in Florida because people think this snake would be a great pet to have. And then they realize that it turns into this 20-foot snake that will actually eat their children. And so they just dump it outside and the snake takes off. Okay, so these organisms, they're introduced by humans and they have no natural predators. And so because they have no natural predators, they will usually be very successful. They've got nothing controlling their population here. And so their population growth will explode. This example here with this toad, this is a poisonous type of toad that essentially eats the native toads. And so that has an impact then on whatever the native toad ate. Okay, that population could get out of control, and these non-native or invasive species, like I said, they're usually very difficult to kill because there is no natural predator. So now you run into the question as to whether you introduce a predator, but then they won't have anybody that competes with them really, or is a predator to them. So the non-native invasive species can be very difficult to get rid of, very difficult to control. So deforestation can also have an impact on ecosystem competition here. Okay, so with deforestation, we're losing, we've got a decrease in habitat available. So there's a decrease in space where these organisms can live. There's also a decrease in producers. So there's a decrease in energy being provided being brought into the ecosystem, as well as a decrease in food supply. So deforestation is actually going to end up increasing competition because it has limited the resources so severely. And then we also have, remember the eutrophication that we saw with the nitrogen cycle? When we increase that amount of nitrogen in the water system, remember from the farmland runoff, from the fertilizer, so when they increase the amount of nitrogen in the water, remember that increases the bacteria and algae populations. And so as that bacteria and algae populations explode, they outcompete the plants and the animals. They outcompete them for oxygen and other resources, and so that can cause the plants and animals to die out. And the last thing I want to look at is the predator-prey relationship here. It's not necessarily a competition, okay, but it has such an impact, and the predators are competing with other predators for prey. Okay, so the predator-prey relationship, remember, this is where one organism is going to actually eat the other. So different than parasitism. You know, a parasite doesn't always want to kill its host. It may end up killing them, but they don't want to kill them because then they have to go find another host. And so remember, the predator is the eater, right? And the prey is the one that's getting eaten. So in this example here, my predator would be my bear, okay? And the salmon there is your prey, okay? And their populations are very, very dependent upon one another. So if you look at this graph here, you can see how closely the predator-prey populations are linked together. You can say they constantly are fluctuating, going up and down together. Okay, so our prey here is obviously going to be our rabbit, with our predator being the coyote. And the rabbit is in blue, and so you notice every time that the rabbit increases, the predator population will increase as well. But you notice the predator population lags behind the prey. The prey is really the one that dictates the predator's population. When there's a large amount of prey available, then there's plenty of food available for the predators. So the predators are able to survive and reproduce easily, and so they start reproducing a lot. So as my predator population increases, they're eating a lot of the prey, and so that actually decreases my prey population. Well, as my prey population decreases, that's going to decrease over time my predator population because there's not going to be enough food for a large number of predators. Well, when my predator population decreases, that allows my prey population to again then rebuild because there's not a lot of predators eating them. Well, again, back to the cycle starts over again. As that prey increases, now there's a lot of food available. Now my predators increase. And over time, as my predators increase, that's going to eventually decrease my prey population. So I get this cycle that occurs of these constant up and down populations happening here. So those two are linked very, very closely together. And they essentially help provide population control for one another. So we'll do a little bit of predator-prey graph analysis and stuff, and we also do a little bit of that population dynamics work in class.